Floyd Abrams, senior counsel in the law firm Cahill, Gordon, and Randell, was once described by Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan as the most significant First Amendment lawyer of our age. He has defended our profession time and time again, and in this age where our president is not really on speaking terms with the Constitution, Mr. Abrams is needed more than ever. I can give you a long list of all the media outlets that Floyd Abrams has represented, along with a long list of all his awards and all his achievements. But if I do that, Floyd won't have a chance to talk. So let me keep quiet and let Floyd talk.
Hello, everybody. When I hear someone say there's important news, my breath is taken aback as I wonder what it is he did this morning. But nothing bad, though. Nothing bad today yet. When I look around here and see some people, a few that I've represented, at least one who got out of jail finally, but all in a good cause. I can't help but think of a line that Reuben Frank, when he hit at NBC News, said to me once in the middle of a case I was doing for NBC, where the other side was arguing about investigative journalism and this and investigative journalism, and I sent him a note saying, give me a definition of investigative journalism. And he wrote back, sunshine is a weather report, a flood is news. Period. So I think of that often when there are press or press-related cases. And I thought I'd start today first with a sort of historical observation. The historical one is that people really don't realize how close we came not to having a First Amendment at all or a Bill of Rights at all. I mean, when the framers met in Philadelphia in 1787, the Revolutionary War had been won, the states were free, the states were allied, but there was no meaningful federal government. And what they did when they wrote a constitution was to create one. And the Constitution itself, for the most part, is a series of rules which they were making up as they went along. There was no such thing as a president then. How long would he serve? What do judges do? How old do you have to be be president? How many people live in a district in the country for purposes of an election? I mean, a series of very important policy decisions, but nothing of the sort of the revolutionary rhetoric of Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Nothing about freedom of speech, nothing about freedom of the press. And that issue arose in Philadelphia when a proposal was made to have a Bill of Rights. And the vote was 10 states no states yes. The other 3 had not arrived yet. So it was unanimous that they would not have a Bill of Rights. And when another delegate said, well, why don't we at least say that the freedom of the press shall be inviolable, Roger Sherman of Connecticut responded by saying, we never said anybody could do anything to the press. Where does it say Congress can interfere with the press or the president can interfere with the press? Why do we have to start saying what they can't do? And the vote on that was, by the time that was voted on, 7-4 against having a free press clause. But there were problems in the ratification process. A lot of states would not sign on without a Bill of Rights. And Jefferson in particular, writing from Paris, where he was the U.S. ambassador, was very strong in saying that a Bill of Rights was what every free people are entitled to, and indicating that he might not support ratification if there was no Bill of Rights. The chief opponent, incidentally, is now, I would say, better known than he was even then. Alexander Hamilton, before he was a musical comedy figure, wrote in the Federalist, why should we begin to list all the things the government can't do that it has no power to do? And Hamilton made arguments that any lawyer and any journalist would recognize immediately. He said, for one thing, if we start listing, we're going to leave things out. And another is that if we start listing, people will think that's all that's protected. So let's not have any list at all. Well, ultimately, Jefferson and that side said we must have a Bill of Rights, carried the day, and we got it. So I thought I would, now that we have it, talk a little bit about how it's faring, and to try to itemize for you what I think the genuine dangers are to the press right now, and a series of verbal thrusts at the press by the president, which seem not to be a realistic threat. For example, the president more than once has said that he wanted to change the libel laws to make it easier, he said, for people like me to bring lawsuits against the press and win. I like to think that by this time, one of his lawyers has told him that there is no federal libel law. So there is nothing to amend or to change. We have 50 state libel laws, all subject to the First Amendment, but we don't have a federal libel law. So a president who wanted one would either have to say, let's do something absolutely really brand new and have, for the first time in American history, a United States libel law, or to say, I'll deal with it by changing the personnel on the Supreme Court by the people that I choose and hope that I get people to do what I want. But in any event, the simple statement that the libel law ought to be changed, or in more than one of his speeches, he said one of the first things he would do as president would be to do that, is simply not realistic. He has said that he wanted to bar journalists from using confidential sources, and then hasn't said that again, but has said it. He said to James Comey that he wanted the FBI to consider, this is Comey's language, putting journalists in jail for publishing classified information. I'll come back to the espionage law in a minute, but simply for publishing classified information has never been viewed as a crime. There have been no prosecutions, and no one's talking about it outside the framework. As I said, I'll deal with the Espionage Act. He urged Comey to investigate leaks of non-classified information. And if we're talking about the First Amendment, he's also said people who burn the American flag ought to lose their citizenship or spend a year in jail. There is what we lawyers call case law about that. There was a time when it was a crime to burn the American flag, but the Supreme Court now, in one case involving a state law, Texas, and in one case involving a U.S. law, has concluded that burning the American flag is a form of free expression which is protected by the First Amendment. So I put those to the side in terms of, at least at this time, realistic threats to the press. It does say something about the way the president views things, that this is what he has said. But I wanted to talk about three areas in which I think the dangers are real. One is the Espionage Act, which has been on the books now literally 100 years. 1917, during World War I, under President Woodrow Wilson, the Espionage Act was written, it became law, and it has some very broad language in it, which has allowed prosecution of individuals in the government who release classified information, and could be argued to allow prosecution of recipients who then, in turn, make the information public if they know that it is classified. Unfortunately, the language of the Espionage Act is very broadly written. I mean, the language in it talks about information, quote, relating to the national defense, which is what every journalist who covers the Defense Department, the State Department, the CIA, et cetera, writes about in one way or another. So we don't have much law about that. The most likely way that really could become a very public issue of very great import is if they go after WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, which is possible and might indeed have even been possible under Hillary Clinton had she been elected. The Obama Department of Justice looked very closely about indicting Assange and ultimately decided that there was no way to prosecute him for what he does without imperiling, as they've been often quoted as saying, the New York Times as well. That whatever one thinks, and my book is very critical of Assange and WikiLeaks, whatever one thinks of what they've done, it's very hard to fashion a prosecution of him in a way which would not significantly put at risk journalists who obtain classified information and publish it. But that's a problem. It's a problem that the Espionage Act is phrased so broadly. It's more good than bad that there's never been a prosecution ever of a journalist under the Espionage Act for what I'm talking about. If it ever came to that, I mean, there's a lot of legislative history that lawyers can use because a proposal had been made to say in the Espionage Act that it covered journalists, and it was defeated. So, I mean, that's the sort of thing lawyers make arguments about. But it's there, and it remains a risk, I think, that is real. A second that may be more obvious relates to confidential sources. We were on the very lip just a few years ago of having a new law adopted, which would have been a federal shield law. There is no federal shield law. States, like New York, for example, have very broad protection for journalists with respect to confidential sources. But the area in which it comes up most often is, again, national security or national security-like situations. The law at this moment is not good in terms of whether the First Amendment provides protection for journalists who assert their right not to reveal confidential sources. There are judges who are friendly, and there is law cases that we can cite. But my firm represented Jim Risen, and confidential sources were sought from him for use in a criminal trial of someone the government claimed was his source. He refused to answer. We argued in the district court, and actually that ruled for us, in the Court of Appeals that ruled against us, in a very broad opinion saying that there was no protection for confidential sources under the First Amendment. And the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. That was followed, by the way, by the criminal trial. The government called Risen to the stand, and he refused to answer source-like questions. And everything just went on. And there was a conviction without any testimony from him. But the ongoing reality is there is no sure protection for journalists who write material or the like based on confidential sources under federal law. And that is particularly so, I would say, in the area of national security. Arguments will be made and they may prevail. But one of the things that struck me during the Risen case was how pleased what I'll call the media bar, lawyers who represent journalists, were that the Supreme Court did not take the case. I mean, we were obliged, I believed and believe, to try, in defending Jim, to do all we could. But it was not easy to explain that to non-clients who had as last on their list of Christmas presents going to the Supreme Court and having it decide ultimately and clearly and unambiguously if journalists have protection for confidential sources. The only time that has been done was in a case in 1972, not involving national security, but involving journalists reporting. There were three cases at once, but the one that went up, a journalist in Louisville, Kentucky, who was reporting on how easy it was for drugs to come into town, to be created, as it were, out of, call them natural substances and the like. He had promised confidentiality to his source. The Louisville district attorney wanted to know the name of the source, and the case wound up in the Supreme Court, and the court, by a 5-4 vote, ruled that the journalist was not entitled to protection against having to testify in front of a grand jury about who his confidential source was. The prosecutor from Louisville was a very young man who had never appeared in the Supreme Court and who wrote as his brief a 4-page document, which, let me tell you, is not much. And the document did not cite a single case from the Supreme Court, which, let me say, is malpractice. So he got up to argue, and Justice William O. Douglas confronted him and said almost what I've just said. Douglas said, "Don't you think in a case of this magnitude, it would have served the cause of justice and this court more if you had done more than to give us a 4-page brief that didn't cite a single case from this court? And the young lawyer said, "You have to remember, I'm a very busy man." And everybody in the courtroom, except Justice Douglas, reacted as you just did. And I've always thought that he walks the streets of Louisville the winner. He won that 5-4 case, and I'm sure he tells everybody how he beat these Washington lawyers and New York lawyers and, being mocked about this or that. Maybe a practicing lawyer shouldn't say it, but sometimes lawyers are not the decisive force in whether you win or lose a case. Sometimes the facts have something to do with it. Sometimes the judges have something to do with it. In any event, the confidential source issue is a real one. And I think it's more likely than not that at some point during this administration, we are going to have some serious challenge to a journalist who refuses to reveal confidential source information. The other area I wanted to mention is more diffuse and even more threatening, I think. And it's not about a particular topic or a particular statute. It's just the impact of the daily denigration of the press by the president. And that being almost an agenda item of this administration. It doesn't just come up when something has been published which they think is outrageous. It comes up all the time. I mean, it comes up as a matter of course, a sort of a daily articulation is a nice word, of disdain for the press and anger and rejection of it as a good faith body of individuals, organizations, and the like, trying to gather news and release it to the public. And that's a real problem, I think. I think it has had impact on the public. Obviously, other things, the very existence and success of Fox News has had real impact with respect to the credibility of other news organizations as viewed through those who get most of their news from Fox News. But I think that's almost a different topic. I think when the President of the United States, however controversial he is, and however much he may be rejected by the polling data, something clearly over 50, usually around 60%. When that is the way he talks about the press, and that is the way he talks about the behavior and the activity of the press, it has enormous impact. That it's already had it, and that is likely to continue. That itself, I think, in and of itself, is a real problem. Not something I think one can deal with in any easy way. I've always thought that the press, especially the best of the press, has just not been a very successful advocate for its own role and its own activities. I mean, Pulitzer Prizes come and go and are a one-day story, and for most people, a no-day story. The amount written about it, the degree to which the public even knows about it, is so limited and this has been the case for a long time. And, it has seemed to me for some time that the press could do a much better job publicizing what it does well, especially in circumstances in which it is sort of provably so that the public has been served. Now, that said, it's not easy to do that without sounding and, in a way, being self-serving. But it does seem to me that there is much more that could be done by way of explaining and the like, just what the press does and how it serves the public when it does it well. I was walking around the museum in Washington a few weeks ago, which is a gorgeous example of what I wish more students could see. There were lots of young people there looking in particular at the Pulitzer Prize-winning photographs through the years. And it seems to me, particularly valuable to have that institution, but to think of that as sort of a paradigmatic example of what would serve the public if more people could do it. One of my wishes is that we could go back to having civics taught in junior high schools, if they still exist, or in however old I was when I first heard about the Constitution. But it was in school, in a public school here in New York, 7th grade, 9th grade, whatever. And it just doesn't happen a whole lot anymore. It does happen to some degree, and I said this once on television, and I got a letter from a teacher in North Carolina outlining for me all the things that they do in her school system, and I felt like I had wrongly attacked her. But it does seem to me that the press as an institution has to do a better job in its self-description to the public. A final note, you can't talk about any of this without talking about the new and grimmer financial situation that besets our newspapers and the like, and the degree to which local, a confession, I buy the tabloids when the Yankees win, period. So I don't get it every day, but it's been a good season, so I get to see it a lot. But the newspapers are like pamphlets in terms of the amount of advertising that they now carry. And of course, that's because it's so much of it is online. And because, for the most part, people don't have to pay to get what they think of as news anyway, and often is news. There's no more important purveyor of information to the public in the world than, you can name them yourselves, but whether it's Google or any of the other large institutions through which most people get their news, that's where they get it. And so we have an interesting group of new First Amendment-like issues that are arising, which are very important and which will not be decided in the courts because they're not really First Amendment issues. They're how we should think about these enormous private institutions with readers in the billions and participants in the billions around the world from which most people in this country and elsewhere in the world get their news. And the really interesting question, which I've gone back and forth on, but the really interesting question is, do we want them to act in a sense as editors or not? That comes up all the time. It came up after Charlottesville, when a pro-Nazi publication was dropped from a number of entities that simply carried it together with everything else they carry. And you know, a really interesting debate is going on. Where should civil libertarians be with respect to the publication of a pro-Nazi publication, for example? Racist material, or the like. We protect hate speech in America. We protect it as a First Amendment matter. The government can't punish a lot of hateful speech, all the speech in Charlottesville. Put aside anything that amounted to threats, but all the speech in Charlottesville, carrying the Nazi flags, the anti-Semitic slogans, surely ongoing racist statements being made, all that is protected by the First Amendment against the government. But that doesn't mean that any private entity has to carry it. And one of the most interesting issues that exists right now, even if one phrases it just as an aspirational matter, is what is it we would like them to do? Would we like or not these enormously wealthy and powerful and private corporations to play the role of, you can use the word censor, or you can use the word editor. All these entities, for example, all the ones that we know the names of, have policies against carrying racist slurs. They don't do a great job often, but they try to deal with that. That's something the government not allowed to do. And someone like me thinks it's a good idea for them to do it. I like them to engage in a limited amount of what I consider editing, deciding, you know, whether they want to carry material of this sort. But that is deeply inconsistent with what First Amendment law limits the government from doing. It also raises certain legal issues of very great importance to those organizations, since under federal law as it now exists, they don't run any risk for libel or the like by simply carrying without comment and without editing the vilest sorts of slurs and libelous, defamatory information. That's become the law because we wanted them to be free to develop, as they have. And the farther down the road they go to saying we're not going to publish this, I use the word publish, and they don't, but we're not going to carry this or that, the more nervous they get that they can be risking their immunity. My own view is that that's their problem, that I don't represent them, so I can speak freely, and that I would prefer, if we're going to have these enormous entities with this enormous power and the capacity to so shape the minds of their readers, that I would rather have them say, for us, racist speech is off limits. and some other categories, but it better not be a lot, of speech is off limits. Now, as I said, it's not a First Amendment issue. Indeed, it results in First Amendment types, maybe, like me, being put to the test of trying to answer for ourselves whether we really think the broadest reading of the First Amendment, which is not just that it's a limitation on the government in order to preserve free expression, which is what I believe and what my book argues, but there are lots of people who view it from a very different prism, which is that the government is not the big problem anymore in America, that Facebook is more important than the government, that Google is more important. They're the people who control speech. And why do you people, First Amendment types, talk all the time about what the government's doing and what the government's not doing, et cetera? Well, there's an answer to that. I mean, only the government has jails. Only the government has an army. Only the government, can really suppress speech. But with that said, this issue as a public policy matter of what we want Facebook to do, what we want Google to do, what sort of policies we would like them to have, because they're doing this every day. I mean, these are ongoing discussions. I mean, these algorithms don't just come from machines. People make decisions about what it is they do and don't want to carry, and you can understand how the general impetus is to say we should carry everything, let the public decide. What's wrong with that? But the other side of that, as I say, is that there are other interests, contravening interests, and those interests might lead someone to say, I mean, even the ACLU has basically taken the position that banning of racist speech, overtly racist speech, on these enormously powerful means of communication, it does not violate, I think that's their view, does not violate the spirit of the First Amendment. So that it seems to me is probably an issue that may have more impact than most of what the government is thinking of doing. But that said, it is the government which we vote for or against. It is the government which does control the power to suppress speech, not by not carrying it themselves, but by banning it. I mean, the 1984 image, the 1984 horror story, is entirely that of government gone out of control. And even when we talk about Facebook and Google and the dangers, and there are dangers, of having a few enormous corporations be the ultimate speech deciders in terms of what is said in a way that it is most likely to be read, that's still a different issue than what may or may not be said in the first place. So thank you all very much for coming. It's good to be here.
How are you going to respond to the issue of Facebook's involvement, voluntary or involuntary, in interfering with the U.S. elections?
I think if Facebook took ads from, if Facebook took Russian money in a manner that could have affected our election, that Mueller has every right and that the First Amendment is not violated by requiring Facebook to turn it over. And I would have said that, I think, even at a time the press was so enormously powerful in a way that it may not be anymore if the question had been directed to a press entity which received money from Russia for the purpose of destroying the fabric of our society. But in any event, as to Mueller and Facebook, I understand Facebook's concerns, but I have to say that I don't think that they're quite as ennobled in their opposition as they would have us think. That is to say, yes, they have certain standards and certain written guidelines, and yes, those guidelines could, in some circumstances, lead them to say, no, we won't turn this over or turn that over. And my answer is maybe the one that people on the other side of First Amendment cases sometimes give, which is, we live in a country based on law, and Facebook has to obey it too. I don't think, in short, that it violates the First Amendment to require an entity engaged in communications in the way Facebook is to turn over information about the efforts of a foreign country to infect ours. I mean, that's a serious cost-benefit analysis of Facebook. How much will they be hurt with their subscribers if they turn over the information? I don't believe, but I'm not knowledgeable enough to have a serious belief. I don't believe it would really interfere with Facebook's credibility with its subscribers if it had to turn over this information. But more important than that, now not as Facebook's lawyer, there are cases that people who have a First Amendment flag ought to lose. And Facebook may say, and may even think, that they shouldn't have to produce anything because the slippery slope is such that if the government can make them produce this, can make them produce that and that and that and that. The area of foreign interference with American political life seems to me one of special sensitivity in which, if there is a serious showing, and there would have to be that has occurred, and that Facebook has either knowingly or not facilitated it, that's criminal behavior. It should be criminal behavior, not by Facebook necessarily. And I think we have a right to address it. Yeah.
A two-part question, Floyd Abrams. Number one, you've said that the press has got to do a better job of saying the good things that they have done. You'll get most reporters are saying, well, just do your job. Specifically, what are we talking about in terms of the good things that the press has done? And if I may, because I have to give this up, I've always gotten the impression, you sit in a briefing room or something like that, reporters have their hands tied, at least one hand tied behind their back, because we're supposed to report. We're not supposed to challenge or get into a fight. So if you could answer those two questions, and perhaps in less than an hour than we have, it would be good.
We have to think of our audience first. I don't have in mind that newspapers, broadcasters, and the like, ought to just start a process of celebration of their day-to-day work. But there was a Pulitzer was awarded blank years ago now to a paper in Texas for reporting that Sikorsky aircraft, which makes helicopters, had made helicopters which crashed on a number of occasions, leading to the death of a great number of American servicemen who were in those helicopters. They're in a town in which Sikorsky is the central business. at great risk to themselves. They did these stories. They were threatened by Sikorsky. They were cut off in terms of certain advertising and the like. It was a great story. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It was a one day or even less than that story around the country. I think that whether it's some press entity that purports to speak for or tries to protect the press, but making an effort to get a story like that out to the public and the contribution that newspaper made, or the newspaper itself, it's asking a lot of them to do it, but that there is a way that people more conversant than I with public relations and public disclosure on a meaningful way of information can, should, and did not get that story out. It was just one in a long list in the New York Times, alone in the country, of all the Pulitzer Prize winners. The local newspaper did publish it and make something of it. But it just seems to me that is one of many examples of enormous public service by publications. Occasionally, you have a movie, Boston Globe, last year's Academy Award movie, Spotlight. Things like that happen, but I don't have the sense that at a time when so many people who care about the First Amendment, care about journalism, are worried and are thinking about what to do, I just don't think that enough thought has been given, and in any event, enough, if any, action has been taken to get out the sort of stories that I had in mind. As regards journalists being limited by editors or publishers or the business side from revealing this or that, I don't have anything to say, really. Yes, that's part of reality. Sometimes, by the way, the lawyers make a contribution by keeping certain stories from being published because journalists do sometimes think that they can show something or prove something that they can't show or prove. And what they have is strong suspicions which are insufficient to make an ultimate assessment. Now, I will say that is the sort of story that leads to more libel cases than any other. And I don't mean necessarily ones that are wrong. Some of the ones that lead to libel suits are ones where there has been an effort not to say anything more than you know and to publish what you do know, and what you do know is true and the like. But the implication in the way it's written sometimes is that you know a lot more, or that they have done a lot worse than what you're revealing. And that's the sort of thing that has led to libel cases. But by the way, speaking of libel, I did want to add to my mini list here early. There really has been a change in very recent time in terms of the level of threat to the press from libel cases. I mean, one could have said 2 years ago that the New York Times didn't have any libel cases. One could have said a little more than that ago that the Time magazine, when it was a large, and very significant publication, and had a lawyer who was full-time doing libel work, found herself in a situation when they had no cases around the country. There was a time, not many years ago, when the large television networks did not have serious libel cases, any of them, going on. And you look around now, and what do you see? You see ABC paying $181 million plus perhaps insurance, but in a South Dakota case about the slime. Now I've just committed libel. You see publication driven out of business as a result of the funding of Hulk Hogan's litigation by a Hollywood billionaire. You see appellate courts starting to say in cases, well, we're not prepared to throw out that case yet. We'll allow the case to go on, and more and more and more. So that world is changing, and that world is changing in part, I think, because of the degree to which judges, jurors, and others are unwilling to assume that journalists act in good faith most of the time. A final story, I don't know how much time we have, but I was on a panel at the American Bar Association a few months ago, and a plaintiff's lawyer was on the panel with me. He said, you know, what I ask a judge to do when I'm picking a jury, I ask the judge to ask the whole panel, a few hundred people, this question: do you think that the press is generally fair? He said, I was just before a panel of 125 people. 121 said no. I mean, that's a real big problem.
Thank you, Floyd. Thank you. Floyd is now a Silurian. We hope to see you on October 18th when Jim Rutenberg is our speaker. And on the way out, we have 25 books for sale. Floyd will be signing them.